can also promise we won't have every single answer. We will do our very best to find the answer and get back to you. So, if we could share the presentation. One second, if you just hit present, Jude. Bear with us just for 1 second. Okay, here we go. All right, what you need to know to apply to the US Embassy and US Diplomatic Mission to Australia's grants funding program. The first part, we'll start off with who we are. We have our embassy in the capital, Canberra, and we also have consulates in Sydney, Melbourne, and Perth. And the reason for this is that our representation aims to connect with all of Australia, with people throughout the country and from all sorts of different walks of lives. And that's a really important element of our grants program, is that we are trying to have a broad connection with the Australian people. If you do apply for a grant, you'll be working specifically with the team at the consulate or the embassy closest to you. And we are part of the public affairs section at the embassy, or at the mission. And the key word here is public. We are trying to connect with Australians, the public. Our embassy does a lot of work government to government with the Australian government, but our role is to connect with the people of Australia and the institutions that serve them, such as cultural organizations, educational organizations, civil society and civic organizations. So that is our role, and I'm sure many of you represent organizations like that today. Some of the ways that we do this connection is by sponsoring exchange programs to send Australians and Americans to each other's countries to have in-person experiences, either studying, learning, or sharing best practices in each other's countries about issues that are important to both of our countries. We also have speaker programs where we send Americans to Australian for lecture tours, to engage at conferences or other types of events. We manage our communication through the media, both through traditional media as well as digital. We also connect US government officials who are visiting Australia to the Australian people, often through visits with students, universities, or with the media. And a big piece of how we engage with the Australian public is by partnering with you through our grants program. All right, so what is the grants program? We offer grants, which are basically a funding mechanism to enhance the US-Australia relationship through public programs. And public doesn't have to mean anybody. It can mean an element of the public. Say, for example, the community that your organization serves, or the audience that attends your cultural institutions programs, or a particular set of students, or a particular population within Australia. We are looking to support well-developed programs that support our strategic priority areas, and I'll get to what those are in just a few minutes. Ultimately, all of the programs we fund need to strengthen bilateral ties between the US and Australia, and they need to have a clear connection to the United States. That can be thematically or by participation with US participants or experts, or it can be with the subject matter that your program covers. And fundamentally, we are trying to increase an understanding of the United States in Australia so that our two countries can work more closely together. All right, so these are our priority areas. Strengthening the US-Australia alliance and the shared values that are the foundation of that alliance. These are things like supporting democratic governance, support for human rights, rule of law, freedom of speech, diversity and inclusion, gender equality, and rights of populations that have historically been discriminated against. Our alliance is really critical to our goals in the world. And so what we can do to make sure that future generations and a broad sector of the Australian public support it is one of the real focus areas of our grants program. We are also looking to highlight our economic partnership. And I encourage you to think about economic partnership in an expansive way. The ways that we're cooperating together with space, in securing critical minerals, developing emerging technology, supporting dynamic economies through entrepreneurship, making sure that women have the opportunity for equal economic empowerment and higher education exchange, particularly in areas that are really fundamental to the economic partnership between our two countries. This is a really exciting area for us, and we love to work on it. Another area of priority for us is a free and open Indo-Pacific, the ways that the US and Australia have leadership across the region, and ways that our two countries can work together to bring together communities from across the Pacific, which touches all of our shores, to counter disinformation, increase good governance, ensure prosperity, and counter malign activity in the region. And the fourth priority area is climate change. I know that many of your organizations and many of the young people, especially that you serve, feel very passionately about climate change. It's a real priority for our mission and for the Biden administration, and we're really excited to receive proposals for ways that the US and Australia can work together to increase or accelerate our emissions reduction, promote environmental preservation, and reduce the devastating impacts of climate change by increasing resilience. The priority audiences that we're really focused on is very broad. We do not discriminate in any way on the basis of any characteristics, as you can see articulated in this slide. We really do want our audiences, the publics that we're connecting with, to reflect the true diversity of Australia and of the United States. In particular, we are interested in funding programs that will engage young Australians, Australians outside of the major metropolitan areas, and Australians from First Nations communities and linguistically and culturally diverse communities. So that's a little bit about the why. Now the how. What can a grant cover? Actually, wanted to skip this, but we're here now. So a grant can cover expenses in these areas: personnel, supplies, travel, honorarium, facilities, and accommodation, particularly if you're inviting someone to travel to Australia as part of an exchange. I think the best way maybe to explain what our grants can do is to show you a few examples of grants we've funded in the past. So we have received a lot of really exciting and compelling grants proposals over the years, and here are some examples of the projects we have supported. We partnered with the University of the Sunshine Coast to bring together university students from across Australia to look at US-Australia relations. Students then participated in a series of workshops to develop policy papers that they presented to the consulate leadership with recommendations for how the US-Australia partnership should look in the Indo-Pacific region. Another grant we supported was a report with the American Chamber of Commerce detailing the value of US trade and investment in Australia, particularly in areas of emerging and frontier technologies. Here are two more examples. We are very excited this year to be supporting Illuminate FNQ's International Science and EcoFest. This is working with First Nations communities in far north Queensland to encourage the study of STEM among students interested in environmental issues. And another project we're very excited about will be happening in September is the Young Pacific Leaders Workshop, which will bring together young leaders from across the Pacific to Sydney to build their network and give them some skills to help them address critical challenges that their generation is going to take the lead in solving. So these are the kinds of things that our grants can support. Just some examples to give you an idea. Some of our partners, we wanted to share this list because it's also showing the diversity of the types of organizations with whom we can partner. University of Sunshine Coast, I already mentioned, the U.S. Study Center, Melbourne Writers Festival, the Human Rights Arts Film Festival, Perth USA Asia Center, University of Southern Queensland, AtSims, and ZASA, and the Melbourne Press Club. All of them had different ideas about how to engage with the Australian public in critical areas, and we supported them through our grants program. So now we can move on a little bit to more of the nuts and bolts of the grants program. Who is eligible for a grant? Well, Australian not-for-profit organizations. They can come from any sector. Unfortunately, we cannot write a grant to a for-profit entity. That's because a grant, rather than a contract, is fundamentally to provide a public benefit, not a benefit to the US government or to generate profit for an outside organization. So the benefit generated through the grant, through the program, through the exchange, is to the Australian and American publics ultimately. You can, grantees can partner with US or other organizations that are also nonprofits. So for example, some of our grants that I mentioned have brought together US and Australian organizations to implement the program that was being funded. Generally, our grants are between $10,000 to $250,000. I know that's a pretty broad range, but most of the grants we fund are between the $25,000 to $75,000 range. We don't determine the basis of the grant by the dollar amount. We start with the concept. And so it's really important that what you focus on is, what are you trying to achieve with this program? Why would we be the right funder? What is the US-Australia connection that's being furthered through your activities? And then how much will it cost? So we screen first based on the quality of the program. And then second, we look, okay, is this a reasonable cost to execute this kind of program? Most grants have a time frame of 12 months. However, we do have multi-year grants and grants that run shorter than 12 months. So we have quite a bit of flexibility in terms of the kinds of activities we fund and how long they take and how much they cost. Projects can be very hyper-local, for example, a festival in your city or town, or they can be much broader. For example, the Young Pacific Leaders Leadership Workshop, which will be truly regional and bring together people from a dozen countries. All of the information about our grants is available on our website, on the embassy's website. It's called the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity. And everything that I'm telling you through this session is outlined in that document. And it forms the basis of us seeking applications for grants. All right, so I already talked about how you need to be a not-for-profit or a non-profit organization. We do have some paperwork. We are a government bureaucracy, so we do have to meet the requirements of our accountability to our taxpayers, and ultimately that's what all of these requirements are for transparency and accountability. So prior to receiving a grant, you have to have a SAMS registration. That is like the state asset management system, I think. Anyway, it gives a unique identifying number to your organization so that you can participate in our grants system. And likewise, this NCAGE number is the number assigned to a business seeking to do business with the United States government. All grants are required to have a US component. I think I already talked about that. That the component can be in terms of participants or theme. And we do require progress reports and final reports from all of our grantees. The way you apply for a grant is outlined in our NOFO on our website, and you are required to submit these 3 forms: the standard application form, the cover sheet, and the proposed budget. These forms, I'll be honest, they look pretty intimidating, but there are a lot of information to help you understand what it means. And although we cannot help you fill out these forms, we can answer questions for you as you go through the development of your proposal. We do, of course, have limitations. What cannot be funded? We cannot provide grants to for-profit organizations. We do not provide funding for partisan political activity or fundraising campaigns. And we do not provide funds for commercial projects or for personal benefit. We do get a lot of proposals that fall within these categories. So generally, for example, we do not fund individual research or individual travel. This is our timeline. We do receive grants on a rolling basis, and then our grants review panel meets 3 times a year, April 1st, July 15th, which is our upcoming deadline. And I encourage you to try to meet this one. We're hoping to have lots of submissions by the July 15th deadline. And then our final submission for our fiscal year will be on August 26th. We will be in touch with anyone who submits a grant application with an answer about whether or not we will be funding your project, usually within 3 to 4 weeks after the review date. We may also have follow-up questions that we reach out to you about. And this is our last slide. These are just tips that we'd like to offer. Please try to be clear about what your project will accomplish and why it benefits Americans and Australians. That is really what our core purpose is, to build stronger connections, deeper understanding between the people of the United States and the people of Australia. So to the extent that your project can support that in a particular way, that is what we're interested in. Please don't let the paperwork make up your mind for you. We unfortunately have had many potential grantees walk away from what they see as an overly burdensome paperwork to either apply for the grant or report on it. I would like to reassure you that most organizations can manage the paperwork. We'd be happy to talk through any particular questions you have about that. And that's my final tip. If you have questions, please ask them of us. And we are very happy to talk to you either about our grants program or about your concept or your project. And with that, we'll stop sharing our presentation. You can contact us at pastgrantsaustralia@state.gov or through your contacts. I know many of the people listening already have connection with either the US Embassy or one of our consulates. Please feel free to put questions in the chat. I think that we already have a couple. So my colleague Jude will read them out.
So we have a question from Amanda. Can you be an Australian individual partnering with a US nonprofit?
Good question. So Amanda's question is, can you be an Australian individual partnering with a US nonprofit? Yes, we can write grants to individuals, and sometimes that's the best mechanism. If you're partnering with a US nonprofit, it might be best for them to submit the application, but that's a particular question. We'd be happy to talk to you more, Amanda, about your particular circumstance and what might be the best mechanism to apply.
Next question from Andrew. Thanks for this. Do you have data on the success rate of the grant?
Okay, the question is, do we have data on the success rate of our grants? I'm not sure if you mean the success rate of how many of the proposals we receive that we do fund, and unfortunately we don't have that information. But in terms of success rate with respect to how well the grants perform, we do ask all grantees to write milestones and objectives and to have a monitoring plan. So that's something that we'll actively participate with you on, seeing how well your project's going, if you're able to meet your targets, working with you if you face obstacles. For example, many of the grants we had funded in 2019 and 2020 were not able to go forward as planned due to the closure of Australia's borders and other COVID restrictions. So we worked closely with the grantees either to postpone the planned date or to overcome that obstacle by going virtual or whatever way we could. So in terms of milestones and objectives, yeah, that's a requirement for all grants.
So we have another question from Peter. I heard that you will fund travel and accommodation expenses for a project, but not individual travel. Can you please clarify the difference between these?
Yes. Okay. That's a great clarification. What kind of travel and accommodation will we cover? If the travel and accommodation is part of a program, for example, you would like to invite a US expert to come out to speak at your conference, or you would like to have a group of Australian students travel to the US for an immersion experience in some field, something like that, where the travel is a critical element of the project, that we can fund. For example, the Young Pacific Leaders program that will bring together leaders from the Pacific, or young leaders from across the Pacific region to Sydney for this workshop, we are funding the travel and accommodation. However, if an individual were to apply for a grant and just say, I would like to go to the US to learn more about the US, can you fund my trip? That's when we would say no. That would be a personal benefit, and we wouldn't fund that kind of travel. I hope that provides some clarity.
We have one more question from Jay. When can projects start for the applications due in July?
This is an excellent question. When can projects start? So the project, for us to fund a project, it cannot already be ongoing. What we fund, we need to have the agreement through the grant, which is fundamentally an agreement between us, the US government, and the organization conducting the program or the project to work together. If the project's ongoing, or if you start spending money before we have that agreement, we cannot provide funding. What we need to do is we sign the grants document, and then we set a program start date, which has to be after the date that we sign the grant. So for example, if you were submitting to the July 15th review deadline for a project starting in September, that would be perfect. We would review maybe on early August. We'd be able to sign the grant, and then you can start your program in September, and you could start spending money for your program at the time we agree upon when we sign the grant. So until we have the signed grant with an actual start date for the project, the grantee cannot spend money in anticipation of having received the grant. I hope that is helpful.
Okay, so another question. This is a follow-on from the travel. I'm just going to go to this one first and then come back to the others that are in there.
Sure.
It just says, for funding of a project related to research, for example, in free and Indo-Pacific region, travel to Pacific countries to gather data, would that be?
Yes, potentially. So the question is, if a project were a research project to gather data that required travel, yes, potentially that could be an appropriate expense for that kind of grant. I think that what is the core purpose of the grant determines the kind of expenses that are appropriate to that grant. So for example, to research an issue that's of mutual importance to the US and Australia, for example, climate change issues in the Pacific that required research to go there in person, and the travel was necessary, then that could definitely be part of a grant in that hypothetical example. But just travel for travel's sake is something that we don't fund. It has to be related to the core purpose of the grant. And one thing that reminded me of that we didn't actually go over in the slideshow is that we do not have to be the sole funder. We can do a cooperative agreement with you, which is a form of grant where we are involved and your organization is involved. We can provide part of the funding if you have support from other organizations, for example. In that case, just talk to us as you're thinking about submitting your grant proposal to us, and we can talk about whether or not we could provide part of the funding. If we did, it would still be under all of the normal requirements that I've described, but we do not have a requirement to be the sole funder. I know some organizations have requirements like that, but we do not.
Another question, so from Jennifer, apologies if this question has already been asked, but is there an average funding amount or range?
The average funding range that we, the US Mission to Australia, generally tend to fund is between 25 to 75,000 US dollars. We do write our grants in US dollars, but then the payment we distribute to you would be in Australian dollars. Excuse me. That's a general range, though. We have funded grants that are less than that and more than that. It really depends on what the project goals and parameters are.
Next question from Darren. If you are an individual working with an organization, for example, a university, what sort of application should we submit?
So for an individual working with an organization, what kind of application to submit? It's a great question. I would say that that's really on a case-by-case basis. So I'd encourage you to reach out to us to talk about that first, because I can just imagine that there would be a lot of different ways that setup might be happening, and would really depend on what's the best funding mechanism for your particular situation, if your project is something that we can support.
This is a follow-on question from Jay. Could you please clarify the scope of Indo-Pacific engagement, examples of what this looked like, in the past?
Sure. So examples of what Indo-Pacific engagement looked like. So remember that we are the U.S. diplomatic mission to Australia. So we are fundamentally about the connection between the U.S. and Australia, and a really important dimension of that is our shared leadership in the region. So the way that the U.S. and Australia are leaders in the Pacific region, and how we work together to highlight that leadership or be more inclusive in that leadership, or how that leadership looks in a particular policy area, such as democracy and good governance, or freedom of the press, or climate change, the example I referenced before. We have funded projects to support networks of journalists in the Pacific. We have funded projects to support climate change adaptation and resilience in the Pacific, where there is an element of the US and Australia working together. Probably the most common area where we've funded so far is bringing together Australian and other young people from around the Pacific, either young people who are going to be leaders in their fields or young journalists, to come together, build their network, strengthen their shared understanding, and often do some skills training or leadership training in an area that's a policy or strategic priority for us. I hope that answers your question. I'm not sure that it does.
So we have another question from Andrew. Is there any restriction on a business consulting to a body or organization and being paid by that body or organization to raise awareness / help them develop an appropriate program project?
Great. So that question's about ongoing relationships that a grantee might have about an advocacy or awareness raising. We do have conflict of interest rules. So if you are an employee of a particular organization, or are working for an organization in the field that your grant would cover, we would need to make sure that there's no conflict of interest. And we would go over that with you as part of our grant screening process to make sure there is no conflict of interest. Receiving a salary from an organization is, one very common form of conflict of interest. So that's something we'd have to look at carefully. But we do understand, people have their own income and salaries, so that can't necessarily preclude. But we do look very carefully at conflict of interest.
So a question from Alicia: does there need to be an outcome, for example, a report after the activity?
That's a great question, Alicia, about an outcome. Yes, all grants generally have an outcome, whether it is the actual event, the training, or the conference. I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of a cough. Excuse me. The output might be the program, or the research report, for example, with our grant with AmCham, or the speaker coming to visit Australia and participating in a workshop or a series of lectures, or whatever the case may be. So those are the outcomes we define through the grant, and we link those to the purpose. Why is it in the interest of the Australian and American people to have that outcome happen? So yes.
We We have another question, this one from Ryan. Would a trainee exchange program between US and Australia meet the requirement?
Great question. Great question, Ryan. 1 second. A trainee exchange program? Potentially. That could be an interesting idea. We do a lot of exchanges. I'd say it's one of our core areas of focus. Our grants often do not fund exchanges because the price is can be so high, but we'd be very happy to talk with you about that concept because it does sound like conceivably it could be something we might be interested in.
A question from Amanda. If the project involves US and Australia, but also involves Canada, France, and the UK, would that be a problem?
Great question. No, we like to focus on building relationships broadly. So a project that encompassed more than the US and Australia, more participants from different countries or from different continents, that definitely could be a possibility. So I think we may have come to the end of our questions, but we would be very happy to follow up with anybody who has further questions or would like to discuss their question in more detail than we can do over this webinar. Our email address is, what is it again? Is it Pass Australia Grants? I have it here written down. I should just check. But if somebody could put that in the chat, yes, it's passgrantsaustralia@state.gov. And we will follow up with everybody who registered for this webinar with the slides and also with some follow-up information. Please feel free to reach out to us anytime. We hope to be able to fund some of the projects that you're working on. We know that there are a lot of great initiatives happening and needing support across Australia, and we look forward to the opportunity to working with many of you. Thank you for taking the time to be here today.